We're starting off this video with one of my absolute favorite tofu tips. We learned this when we first went vegan from Mary's Test Kitchen, and that is if you want the very best meat-like texture from tofu, you have to freeze it first. To do that, you are just going to take your store-bought package, throw it directly into the freezer, and let it completely freeze. It will be literally hard as a brick when it is frozen. To thaw this, you're just gonna leave it in your fridge overnight, or you can submerge it in some water if you need it a little bit faster. You can leave tofu frozen inside of your freezer for about 3 months or so. And so what we do is we just buy a couple packages in bulk and throw them into the freezer and then use them as we need.
I wanted to show you the difference between frozen and not. The light on the right is the not frozen, and then the left has been frozen and thawed, and you can see the texture difference between the two. Now, what you're gonna do is grab a tofu press and press out your thawed tofu for at least 30 minutes. This is helping to get any excess water out so our tofu takes on a better flavor. You can also let this sit overnight if that works better for you.
A tofu press has to be one of the best tools that we have gotten for the kitchen since going vegan. If you don't have one though, you can still press out your tofu, just wrap it in a kitchen towel and then put something heavy on it like a cast iron pan or even just a few books.
Once your tofu has been pressed, you are just going to remove it from the press and then just lightly press it into a towel to get any remaining water on the outside off. For the most authentic looking pieces of vegan chicken, you want to look for the natural breaks in the tofu. Break your tofu into a few pieces. Each block should be able to get about 5 to 6 pieces, and don't worry about this needing to look perfect or be perfect. It's fine whatever you get.
Alternatively, you can just slice your tofu in half and slice it in half again if you would prefer to do it that way. It is a little bit faster than trying to make sure it naturally breaks and you don't have all these random pieces. You can also cube this if you would like more of like a nugget size. You can also just slice it in half and leave it bigger if you would prefer more of like a patty size or a chicken breast size that maybe you would put on like a sandwich or something. The possibilities are really endless and completely up to you.
Now we're going to start with our batter. First, the wet mix, we are going to add non-dairy milk, apple cider vinegar, salt, and garlic powder and whisk that together well. You want to really make sure that you distribute your seasonings here.
The reason for the vinegar is because when you add an acid, so vinegar, lemon juice, lime juice, some other type of citrus juice, to non-dairy milk, it mimics dairy buttermilk. And what we are trying to do there is get it to curdle, so we let it sit for a few minutes. The higher the protein in the non-dairy milk, the more curdles you will have. So something like a soy milk will have a lot more than an almond milk. They can be used interchangeably. It doesn't really matter, but just in case you're nervous about what it looks like, it is okay if you have more curdles versus other times you don't.
Now for our dry mix, we are adding flour to a shallow bowl and then adding all of our spices. You can use a gluten-free 1-to-1 flour if needed. Pause on the screen to see the spices, and then we are just going to whisk that together really well, really making sure to distribute our spices evenly. Then what you want to do is add a few tablespoons of the wet mix into your dry mix. I really like to try to spread out the wet mix over versus all in one place, and then just use your hands to combine the two mixes together.
The reason we're going to be adding a little bit of the wet mixture to the dry mixture is because it will create these little clumps of dough inside of our mixture, so when we batter and bread the pieces of tofu, it will actually create these extra crispy pieces of dough inside of it when you take a bite of it, and it's just pure deliciousness.
Take a piece of tofu and dip it into your wet mixture and then press it down, then flip and repeat. Then move to your dry mixture and make sure all of your sides are coated well. Shake off any excess and then repeat with your other remaining pieces.
I just want to point out that we pressed down on our tofu when we were adding it into the wet mixture. You want to do that so the flavor actually soaks up into the layers of the tofu and we get a really great flavor throughout it. I also want to say that if you want an extra crispy piece of fried tofu, what you're going to do is after you do the wet and dry coat, you're going to just repeat the process again. That creates another layer of batter and it gets extra crispy, but it does take a little bit longer and you will need to double up your mixtures for both of them.
Before breading your tofu, you want to start your oil, and then by the time you are done breading, your oil should be ready. Use a thermometer to check your temperature and make sure that it's accurate. When ready, you want to drop in your pieces of tofu into the oil and cook until golden brown, about 2 to 3 minutes, flipping if needed depending on how big your pot is.
One of the most important things you can do when you are frying something is to make sure that you use a food thermometer, and that's because we want to make sure that our temperature is correct. If you have a temp on a too low side, you are going to absorb a lot more grease before it cooks all the way or gets that golden brown color. That's when, if you have something you're like, oh, this tastes a little greasy, that's why the temp was probably probably too low. Alternatively, if you have your temperature too high, it is going to burn the outside before the inside gets cooked. And so we don't want either of those things to happen. So grab a really cheap food thermometer. I will link one in the description, and you will just have the perfect temperature every single time.
Once your tofu is finished, you are going to move it to a paper towel lined plate or a baking rack with a baking sheet underneath. Work in batches if needed so you don't overcrowd your pan. If working in batches, check your oil midway so your oil temp doesn't go up or down too much. You can air fry your tofu, also, which I'm showing here on the left. It was lightly sprayed with oil, and the biggest tip if you're air frying and you don't want to use any oil is to really make sure the excess flour is taken off. And that's it. Perfectly golden fried vegan chicken every single time. It is so crispy on the outside and yet perfectly juicy on the inside. It is absolutely amazing.
I'm telling you, this vegan fried chicken is going to change your life. You have to try it. Full recipe at makeitdairyfree.com. It's so good.